To understand the Vietnam War, we must first go back to the 19th century. Long before American soldiers arrived in Vietnam, the country had already spent decades under foreign control. During the 1800s, Vietnam became part of the French colonial empire. The region was governed by France and was incorporated into a larger territory known as French Indochina, which included Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. French authorities controlled the economy, natural resources, and political system of the region. Large plantations were established to produce rice, rubber, and other valuable crops for export to Europe, while a small group of local elites benefited from cooperation with the colonial government. Most Vietnamese people experienced poverty and harsh working conditions. Heavy taxes and forced labor created widespread resentment among the population. Over time, this resentment began to fuel a growing independence movement. One of the most important figures to emerge from this movement was Ho Chi Minh. Born in 1890, Ho Chi Minh traveled across Europe and Asia while studying political ideas and revolutionary movements. During his time abroad, he became deeply influenced by communist ideology and the idea that colonial nations should be liberated from imperial rule. When he returned to Southeast Asia, he dedicated himself to organizing resistance against French control. During the early 20th century, Vietnamese nationalists began forming underground political groups and resistance networks. Many activists believed that independence could only be achieved through organized struggle. As these movements grew stronger, French authorities attempted to suppress them through arrests, censorship, and military force. Despite these efforts, revolutionary ideas continued spreading among students, workers, and farmers across the country. The situation changed dramatically during World War II. In 1940, Japanese forces occupied Vietnam while France itself was weakened by the war in Europe. Although French officials technically remained in charge, real power shifted to the Japanese military. The occupation created chaos across the region. Food shortages and economic disruption caused widespread suffering among the Vietnamese population. During this period, Ho Chi Minh organized a revolutionary movement known as the Viet Minh. This group combined nationalist and communist ideals and aimed to achieve independence for Vietnam. As World War II came to an end in 1945, Japan's defeat created a sudden power vacuum in Vietnam. Seizing this opportunity, Ho Chi Minh and the Viet Minh launched a political uprising known as the August Revolution. In September 1945, Ho Chi Minh stood before a large crowd in Hanoi and declared the independence of Vietnam. He announced the creation of a new nation called the Democratic Republic of Vietnam. For many Vietnamese people, this moment symbolized the end of decades of colonial domination and the beginning of a new era of national freedom. However, the struggle for independence was far from over. France soon attempted to re-establish control over its former colony. French troops returned to Vietnam and began reasserting authority across the region. Negotiations between the Vietnamese leadership and the French government quickly collapsed. By 1946, tensions had escalated into open conflict. This new conflict would become known as the First Indochina War. The First Indochina War marked the beginning of a long and brutal struggle that would eventually draw the attention of the world's most powerful nations. For the people of Vietnam, the fight was not only about politics or ideology. It was a fight for independence, national identity, and the right to determine their own future. Over the next several years, the conflict would grow more intense, leading to one of the most decisive battles in modern Asian history and setting the stage for the larger Vietnam War that would follow. After the Declaration of Independence in Nai Chi, 1945, Vietnam entered a new and dangerous phase of its history. The French government refused to accept the loss of its colony and began sending troops back to Southeast Asia. France believed that restoring control over Vietnam was necessary to rebuild its colonial empire after the devastation of World War II. But for many Vietnamese people, independence had already been declared, and they were ready to fight to defend it. The conflict that followed became known as the First Indochina War. Beginning in 1946, French forces attempted to regain control of cities, ports, and transportation routes across the country. Meanwhile, Vietnamese revolutionary fighters organized under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh and his military commander Vo Nguyen Giap. Together they built a disciplined revolutionary army known as the Viet Minh, unlike the French military, which relied on heavy weapons and traditional battlefield tactics. The Viet Minh used guerrilla warfare. They attacked French supply lines, ambushed soldiers, and disappeared into jungles and mountains before the enemy could respond. Villages across Vietnam often supported the resistance movement by providing food, shelter, and intelligence. This made it extremely difficult for French forces to defeat them. During the early years of the war, France believed its superior military power would eventually defeat the Vietnamese fighters. However, the conflict gradually became more complicated because of global politics. The world was entering the era of the Cold War. Communist governments in China and the Soviet Union began supporting the Viet Minh with weapons, training, and supplies. This support strengthened the Vietnamese resistance and helped transform the conflict into an international struggle connected to the larger Cold War rivalry. As the war continued, the French military attempted to draw the Viet Minh into a decisive battle where modern firepower could defeat them. French commanders believed that if they could force the Vietnamese army to fight in open terrain, the French Air Force and artillery would destroy them. This strategy led to one of the most famous battles in 20th century warfare. The Battle of Dien Bien Phu. In 1954, French forces established a large military base in a remote valley surrounded by mountains near the border with Laos. The French believed that their fortified base would lure the Viet Minh into a battle they could not win. However, General von Nguyen Giap had a very different plan. Instead of attacking recklessly, Vietnamese forces slowly surrounded the valley and secretly transported heavy artillery into the surrounding hills. Thousands of soldiers and workers carried weapons through jungles and mountains to positions overlooking the French base. When the battle began, the Viet Minh launched a massive artillery bombardment that shocked the French commanders. From the mountains above the valley, Vietnamese guns destroyed airstrips, supply depots, and defensive positions. French troops suddenly found themselves trapped inside the valley with no safe way to escape. Over the next several weeks, the battle turned into a brutal siege. French soldiers fought desperately while Viet Minh forces continued tightening their control around the base. By May 1954, the situation had become hopeless for the French army. Supplies were running out, defenses were collapsing, and Vietnamese forces had captured most of the surrounding positions. Eventually, the French commander ordered the remaining troops to surrender. The defeat shocked France and the entire international community. The fall of Dien Bien Phu proved that a colonial army could be defeated by a determined independence movement. Soon after the battle, international negotiations began to determine the future of Vietnam. Representatives from several countries gathered in Switzerland to discuss a possible peace settlement. These talks would lead to a historic agreement that reshaped the political map of Southeast Asia and created the conditions that would eventually lead to the Vietnam War. The defeat of French forces at the Battle of Dien Bien Phu in 1954 forced the world to confront a new political reality in Southeast Asia. France could no longer maintain its colonial rule in Vietnam. The question that remained was what would happen next. To solve the crisis, representatives from several major nations gathered in Switzerland for an international conference. This meeting became known as the Geneva Conference. The goal of the conference was to create a peaceful solution for Vietnam after years of war between French colonial forces and Vietnamese independence fighters. During the negotiations, diplomats from multiple countries debated how the country should be governed and whether it could remain unified. Eventually, the talks produced an agreement known as the Geneva Accords. According to this agreement, Vietnam would be temporarily divided into two separate regions along the 17th parallel. The northern half of the country would be controlled by the communist-led government of Ho Chi Minh. The southern half would be governed by a non-communist administration supported by Western countries, particularly the United States. The division was meant to be temporary. The plan was to hold national elections within 2 years so that the Vietnamese people could choose a single government and reunify the country peacefully. However, those elections never happened. Political tensions between the two sides quickly increased, and international Cold War politics made the situation even more complicated. In the northern region, Ho Chi Minh and his government began organizing a socialist state with strong support from communist allies such as the Soviet Union and China. Their long-term goal was to reunify Vietnam under a communist system. Meanwhile, the southern region developed a very different political system. The government of South Vietnam was led by Ngo Dinh Diem. Diem was strongly anti-communist and received economic and military support from the United States. American leaders believed that if South Vietnam fell under communist control, it could trigger a chain reaction across Asia. This fear was known as the domino theory. According to this idea, if one country became communist, neighboring countries might follow, like a row of dominoes falling one after another. Because of this belief, the United States began increasing its involvement in South Vietnam. At first, American support came through financial aid, military training, and advisors who helped organize the South Vietnamese army. Washington hoped that strengthening the South Vietnamese government would prevent communist influence from spreading further across the region. However, the political situation inside South Vietnam soon became unstable. Many citizens were unhappy with the leadership of Ngo Dinh Diem. His government was accused of corruption, favoritism, and harsh repression of political opponents. Some religious groups, especially Buddhists, protested against policies they believed were unfair. These tensions weakened the government and created opportunities for opposition movements to grow stronger. At the same time, communist supporters in the South began organizing a resistance movement. These fighters became known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong operated in rural villages and jungles, launching surprise attacks against South Vietnamese military forces and government officials. Their strategy relied on guerrilla warfare, hidden supply networks, and support from local populations. As violence increased during the late 1950s and early 1960s, the conflict in Vietnam slowly transformed into a larger and more dangerous war. What had once been a struggle against colonial rule was now becoming a battleground in the global Cold War. The division created by the Geneva Accords had not brought peace. Instead, it created two rival governments, each determined to shape the future of Vietnam in completely different ways. The growing instability inside South Vietnam would soon draw the United States even deeper into the conflict. Within a few years, American leaders would face a difficult decision, whether to remain only advisors in the region or to commit their military forces directly to war. After the division of Vietnam, tensions between the North and the South continued to increase. In the southern region, the government of Ngo Dinh Diem struggled to maintain stability. Although he had strong support from the United States, many citizens inside South Vietnam were unhappy with his leadership. His government was accused of corruption, political repression, and favoritism towards certain groups. Opposition parties were often suppressed, and many critics were arrested. These actions created deep frustration among large parts of the population. At the same time, communist supporters in South Vietnam began building an organized resistance movement. This movement became known as the Viet Cong. The Viet Cong fighters used guerrilla warfare tactics that made them extremely difficult to defeat. Instead of fighting traditional battles, they launched surprise attacks, ambushed military patrols, and disappeared into the jungles or villages before government forces could respond. They also built complex underground tunnel networks where fighters could hide, move supplies, and plan operations without being detected. During the early 1960s, the conflict in South Vietnam grew more violent. The Viet Cong gained influence in many rural areas, while the South Vietnamese government struggled to maintain control. American leaders feared that if the government of South Vietnam collapsed, the entire region might fall under communist influence. At this time, the President of the United States was John F. Kennedy. Kennedy believed that preventing the spread of communism in Southeast Asia was an important part of American foreign policy. Because of this belief, the United States began sending military advisors to help train and support the South Vietnamese army. Over time, the number of American advisors in Vietnam increased significantly. Their mission was officially limited to training and assisting South Vietnamese forces rather than fighting directly in combat. However, the situation on the ground was becoming increasingly dangerous. The Viet Cong were carrying out more frequent attacks, and the South Vietnamese army often struggled to defend remote villages and territories. As the conflict intensified, American advisors found themselves becoming more involved in military operations. Meanwhile, political tensions inside South Vietnam reached a breaking point. Large protests began spreading across the country, particularly among Buddhist communities who believed the government was discriminating against them. Images of demonstrations and violent crackdowns shocked the international community. In 1963, a group of South Vietnamese military officers carried out a coup against President Ngo Dinh Diem. During the coup, Diem was removed from power and later killed. His overthrow created a power vacuum in South Vietnam and led to a period of political instability. In the same year, another dramatic event changed the direction of American policy. In November 1963, President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the United States. After his death, the new American president became Lyndon B. Johnson. Johnson inherited a rapidly worsening situation in Vietnam. He faced increasing pressure from military advisors and political leaders who believed that stronger action was necessary to prevent the spread of communism. The turning point came in 1964 during an event known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident. According to reports at the time, North Vietnamese patrol boats had attacked American naval vessels in the Gulf of Tonkin. In response, the United States Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, which gave President Johnson the authority to use military force in Vietnam without formally declaring war. This decision dramatically changed the scale of the conflict. Soon after this resolution was passed, the United States began sending large numbers of combat troops to Vietnam. What had once been a regional conflict between North and South Vietnam was now transforming into a major international war involving one of the most powerful militaries in the world. American commanders believed that advanced weapons, air power, and modern technology would allow them to defeat communist forces quickly. However, they would soon discover that fighting a guerrilla war in the jungles of Vietnam would be far more difficult than they had imagined. After the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution in 1964, the United States began increasing its military involvement in Vietnam on a massive scale. President Lyndon B. Johnson believed that if South Vietnam collapsed, communism could spread throughout Southeast Asia. American leaders feared that countries like Laos, Cambodia, and even Thailand might eventually fall under communist influence. This belief was strongly connected to the domino theory, which suggested that if one country fell to communism, others would soon follow. In 1965, the United States officially began sending large numbers of combat troops to Vietnam. American soldiers arrived in the southern region to support the South Vietnamese army and fight against both the Viet Cong guerrillas and the regular army of North Vietnam. Within a short time, the number of American troops grew rapidly. By the late 1960s, more than 500,000 American soldiers were stationed in Vietnam. The American military believed that its advanced technology would give it a major advantage in the conflict. The United States had powerful air forces, helicopters, heavy artillery, and modern weapons. Helicopters became one of the most important tools of the war. Aircraft such as the famous Huey helicopters were used to transport soldiers quickly into remote jungle areas, evacuate wounded troops, and supply military bases scattered across the countryside. However, Vietnam's geography made the war extremely difficult. The country was covered with dense jungles, mountains, and rivers. These environments provided perfect hiding places for guerrilla fighters. The Viet Cong used their knowledge of the land to launch surprise attacks and then disappear. Before American troops could respond, they built extensive tunnel networks beneath villages and forests where fighters could hide, move supplies, and plan operations. To weaken communist forces, the United States launched a massive bombing campaign against North Vietnam known as Operation Rolling Thunder. The goal of this operation was to destroy military infrastructure, supply routes, and industrial facilities that supported the North Vietnamese war effort. American aircraft dropped thousands of tons of bombs across northern Vietnam in an attempt to pressure the communist government into ending the conflict. At the same time, American troops carried out large search and destroy missions across the jungles of South Vietnam. These missions aimed to locate Viet Cong fighters and destroy their bases. However, the guerrilla fighters often avoided direct confrontation. Instead, they relied on ambushes, traps, and hit-and-run attacks. The enemy was often difficult to identify, since fighters could blend into local villages. As the war intensified, casualties began to increase on all sides. American soldiers faced constant danger from hidden mines, booby traps, and sudden ambushes. The psychological stress of jungle warfare made the conflict extremely exhausting for troops. Despite the enormous military power of the United States, it became clear that the war would not end quickly. By the late 1960s, Vietnam had turned into one of the most intense battlefields of the Cold War. What began as a regional conflict had now evolved into a massive international war involving millions of soldiers, advanced technology, and enormous political consequences for both Vietnam and the United States. By the late 1960s, the Vietnam War had become one of the largest military conflicts of the Cold War. More than 500,000 American soldiers were now stationed across South Vietnam. Military commanders in Washington and Saigon believed that communist forces were slowly losing their strength. Reports from the battlefield often suggested that the United States was making progress and that victory might eventually be possible. However, the communist leadership in North Vietnam was preparing a massive surprise attack that would change the direction of the war. The plan was organized by the government of North Vietnam together with the guerrilla fighters of the Viet Cong. Their goal was to launch a coordinated attack across many cities and military bases in South Vietnam at the same time. The offensive began in January 1968 during the Vietnamese holiday known as Tet, which marks the Lunar New Year. Because the holiday was traditionally a time of ceasefire, many South Vietnamese and American soldiers expected the fighting to slow down. Instead, thousands of communist fighters suddenly launched attacks across the country. This coordinated assault became known as the Tet Offensive. Communist forces attacked more than 100 cities, towns, and military installations. Major battles erupted in places such as Hue, Da Nang, and even the capital city of Saigon. One of the most shocking moments of the offensive occurred when Viet Cong fighters managed to attack the United States Embassy compound in Saigon. Although the attackers were eventually defeated, the event shocked the American public and demonstrated that the war was far from over. The city of Hue became one of the most intense battlefields during the offensive. For several weeks, American and South Vietnamese troops fought fierce street battles to regain control of the city. Buildings were destroyed, neighborhoods were devastated, and thousands of soldiers and civilians were killed during the fighting. The battle for Hue became one of the longest and bloodiest urban battles of the entire Vietnam War. Although American and South Vietnamese forces eventually pushed back the communist attackers, the Tet Offensive had a major psychological impact. Military leaders had claimed that the enemy was close to defeat, yet the massive scale of the attacks showed that communist forces were still capable of launching large and coordinated operations. The offensive revealed that the war was far more complex and difficult than many people had believed. News reports and television footage from the battles reached millions of viewers in the United States. For the first time, many Americans saw the harsh reality of the war unfolding on their television screens. Images of destroyed cities, wounded soldiers, and intense fighting began to change public opinion. Many people started questioning whether the war could truly be won. As protests against the war grew stronger across the United States, political pressure on the American government also increased. The Tet Offensive did not give the communist forces a clear military victory, but it succeeded in changing how the war was perceived around the world. From this point forward, the Vietnam War would increasingly become a political and psychological struggle as much as a military conflict. After the Tet Offensive of 1968, the Vietnam War entered a new and very different phase. Although American and South Vietnamese forces had successfully pushed back the communist attacks, the offensive had created a powerful psychological shock in the United States. For years, government officials had claimed that victory in Vietnam was close. However, the massive surprise attacks during the Tet Offensive convinced many Americans that the war was far from over. As television images of the fighting reached millions of homes across the United States, public opinion began to change dramatically. The Vietnam War had become the first major conflict in history to be widely broadcast on television. Viewers could see wounded soldiers, destroyed villages, and intense battles unfolding thousands of miles away. These images caused many people to question whether the war was worth the enormous cost in human lives and resources. Across the United States, protests against the war began to grow larger and more frequent. University campuses became major centers of anti-war demonstrations. Students organized rallies, marches, and public debates criticizing the government's policy in Vietnam. Many protesters argued that the war was unnecessary and that American soldiers were dying in a conflict that had no clear victory. At the same time, families of soldiers who were fighting overseas began demanding answers from political leaders. The number of American casualties continued to rise, and the war was costing billions of dollars each year. These factors created intense political pressure on the American government. In 1968, another major political change occurred. The United States elected a new president, Richard Nixon. Nixon inherited a war that had already lasted for many years and had deeply divided American society. Instead of expanding the war further, Nixon announced a new strategy known as Vietnamization. Vietnamization was a plan to gradually reduce the number of American troops fighting in Vietnam while increasing the responsibility of the South Vietnamese Army. The idea was to train and equip South Vietnamese forces so they could defend their country without relying heavily on American soldiers. Under this plan, thousands of U.S. troops began returning home. However, the war did not end immediately. Even as American troops were being withdrawn, heavy fighting continued across Vietnam. North Vietnamese forces were determined to reunify the country under communist rule, while the South Vietnamese government struggled to maintain control. During this period, the conflict also expanded beyond Vietnam's borders. Military operations spread into neighboring countries such as Cambodia and Laos as American forces attempted to destroy communist supply routes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. These actions created even more controversy and protests in the United States. Despite the ongoing fighting, it became increasingly clear that the United States was searching for a way to end its direct involvement in the war. Negotiations between American, North Vietnamese, and South Vietnamese representatives began. In Paris, in an effort to reach a peace agreement, these negotiations would eventually lead to the next stage of the conflict and the beginning of the final chapter of the Vietnam War. By the early 1970s, the Vietnam War had already lasted for more than a decade, and both sides had suffered enormous losses. Millions of Vietnamese civilians and soldiers had died, while thousands of American troops had also lost their lives. At the same time, the war had created deep divisions inside the United States. Political leaders understood that the Saigon conflict could not continue forever. As a result, diplomatic efforts to end the war became increasingly important. Peace negotiations between the United States, North Vietnam, South Vietnam, and representatives of the Viet Cong began in the French capital. These negotiations became known as the Paris peace talks. The talks lasted for several years and were extremely complicated. Each side had different goals and demands, and reaching an agreement proved very difficult. The United States wanted to withdraw its troops while ensuring that the government of South Vietnam could survive. North Vietnam, however, wanted the complete reunification of the country under communist leadership. Despite these differences, both sides eventually recognized that continuing the war indefinitely would only cause more destruction. During this period, President Richard Nixon continued implementing the policy of Vietnamization. American troops gradually left Vietnam while the South Vietnamese Army took greater responsibility for the fighting. However, the conflict remained intense as North Vietnamese forces continued launching attacks across the region. One of the key elements supporting communist military operations was a complex network of supply routes known as the Ho Chi Minh Trail. This trail allowed weapons, food, and soldiers to move from North Vietnam into South Vietnam through dense jungles and mountainous terrain. Despite heavy bombing campaigns by American forces, the trail continued operating and played a crucial role in sustaining the communist war effort. Finally, in 1973, a peace agreement was reached during the Paris negotiations. The agreement called for a ceasefire and the complete withdrawal of American combat troops from Vietnam. The United States officially ended its direct military involvement in the war, and thousands of American soldiers returned home. However, the peace agreement did not fully end the conflict between North and South Vietnam. Although American forces had left the battlefield, fighting between Vietnamese forces continued. The government of South Vietnam struggled to defend itself without the large-scale military support it had previously received from the United States. For a brief moment, it appeared that the war might slowly come to an end through diplomacy. But, in reality, the final chapter of the Vietnam War had not yet been written. Within only a few years, events would move quickly toward a dramatic conclusion that would permanently change the future of Vietnam. After the United States withdrew its combat troops in 1973, the Vietnam War entered its final stage. Although a peace agreement had been signed in Paris, the ceasefire did not truly bring peace to the country. Fighting between the forces of North Vietnam and South Vietnam continued across many regions. Without the presence of large numbers of American soldiers, the government of South Vietnam found it increasingly difficult to defend its territory. At this time, the communist leadership in North Vietnam believed that the moment had come to reunify the country. North Vietnamese military commanders began planning a major offensive that would defeat the South Vietnamese army once and for all. Their strategy was to launch rapid attacks across multiple regions, capture key cities, and collapse the political authority of South Vietnam. In early 1975, North Vietnamese forces began advancing through the central highlands of Vietnam. These attacks quickly overwhelmed many South Vietnamese defensive positions. Entire provinces began falling under communist control. The speed of the offensive shocked the South Vietnamese government and created panic among military commanders and civilians alike. As the North Vietnamese army moved closer to major cities, millions of civilians began fleeing their homes in search of safety. Roads became crowded with refugees carrying their belongings as they attempted to escape the advancing forces. The South Vietnamese army struggled to organize an effective defense while the situation continued to deteriorate. Within weeks, the North Vietnamese forces captured several important cities across the country. Each victory weakened the authority of the South Vietnamese government. Military units began retreating, and political leaders in Saigon realized that the collapse of their state might be unavoidable. By April 1975, the Communist Army was approaching the capital city of Saigon. The fall of the city would mark the end of South Vietnam. As panic spread throughout the capital, thousands of civilians gathered near the American embassy, hoping to escape the country. In response, the United States began an emergency evacuation operation to rescue American citizens and some Vietnamese allies. Helicopters flew continuously between the embassy and ships waiting offshore, transporting people out of the city. Images of helicopters lifting desperate refugees from rooftops became some of the most famous and dramatic scenes of the entire war. Despite these efforts, many people were unable to leave before the city fell. On April 30, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks entered the streets of Saigon. The government of South Vietnam officially surrendered. This historic moment became known as the Fall of Saigon. With the capture of the capital, the Vietnam War effectively came to an end. The victory of North Vietnam resulted in the reunification of the country under communist leadership. Saigon was later renamed Ho Chi Minh City in Doi Dela's honor of the revolutionary leader who had inspired the struggle for independence. After decades of war, Vietnam finally became a single unified nation. However, the consequences of the war would continue to shape the country and the world for many years to come. Millions of lives had been lost, entire cities had been destroyed, and both Vietnam and the United States faced the challenge of recovering from one of the most difficult conflicts of the 20th century. The fall of Saigon in April 1975 officially ended one of the longest and most controversial wars of the 20th century. After decades of fighting, Vietnam was finally reunified under a single government led by the communist leadership of Vietnam. The capital of the former South Vietnam, Saigon, was renamed Ho Chi Minh City in honor of the revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh. Although the war had ended, the country faced enormous challenges. Years of bombing, military operations, and political conflict had devastated much of Vietnam's infrastructure. Cities, roads, farmland, and industries had been severely damaged. Millions of people had lost their homes, and many families were still searching for missing relatives. Rebuilding the nation would take many years of effort and sacrifice. The human cost of the war was staggering. Historians estimate that more than 3 million Vietnamese soldiers and civilians died during the conflict. On the American side, more than 58,000 soldiers lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands more were wounded, and many veterans returned home with physical and psychological scars that would affect them for the rest of their lives. The war also had a powerful impact on the United States. For many Americans, the Vietnam War created a deep crisis of confidence in government leadership. The conflict had lasted for years without a clear victory, and many citizens began questioning the decisions made by political leaders. The anti-war movement that had grown during the conflict became one of the largest protest movements in American history. After the war, the United States government began rethinking its foreign policy and military strategy. Many leaders became more cautious about sending large numbers of troops into overseas conflicts. The lessons of Vietnam would influence American political decisions for decades. At the same time, the war reshaped global politics during the Cold War. The conflict demonstrated how regional struggles could become part of a larger ideological battle between communism and capitalism. The involvement of major powers such as the United States, the Soviet Union, and China showed how deeply the Cold War affected international conflicts. Despite the destruction caused by the war, Vietnam slowly began rebuilding its economy and society in the years that followed. Over time, the country reopened its economy, developed new industries, and expanded international trade. Today, Vietnam is a rapidly developing nation with growing cities, modern industries, and a population that continues to move forward after the hardships of the past. The story of the Vietnam War remains one of the most complex chapters in modern history. It was a conflict shaped by colonialism, nationalism, ideology, and global power struggles. For Vietnam, it was a war for independence and national unity. For the United States, it became a difficult lesson about the limits of military power and the importance of understanding local conflicts. Even decades later, the legacy of the Vietnam War continues to influence politics, diplomacy, and historical debate around the world. Understanding this history helps us see how the decisions of leaders and the struggles of ordinary people can shape the course of nations and the future of the world. The Vietnam War left a deep mark on both Vietnam and the United States. For Vietnam, the war was a long struggle for independence, unity, and national identity. Decades of conflict had destroyed cities, farms, and communities, yet the country slowly rebuilt itself and moved forward. Today, Vietnam stands as a growing nation in Southeast Asia, with expanding cities and a young generation shaping its future. For the United States, the war created one of the most difficult periods in modern political history. Many Americans questioned the decisions that had led their country into such a long and costly conflict. The experience changed how the nation viewed military intervention around the world. It also influenced how future wars would be debated and understood by both the government and the public. The Vietnam War also revealed the limits of military power. Despite advanced technology and one of the strongest armies in the world, victory was not guaranteed in a conflict shaped by local politics, guerrilla tactics, and national determination. The war demonstrated how complicated modern conflicts can become when international politics, ideology, and national independence movements collide. Across Vietnam today, there are memorials and historical sites that remind people of the sacrifices made during those years. In the United States, the names of thousands of soldiers who lost their lives are carved into the stone walls of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. These memorials stand as powerful reminders of the cost of war and the importance of remembering history. More than anything, the Vietnam War teaches us how deeply war can affect nations and generations. It is a story of courage, tragedy, political struggle, and human endurance. By studying this history, we gain a better understanding of the world and the choices that shape the future of nations.